live. I'm starting a new book. It's entitled The Invisible Way. You wonder how I find them. They find me. I had this book, which is actually the second in a trilogy, but I don't have the first one. The Invisible Way, A Time to Love, A Time to Die, by Reshad Feild. Reshad Feild. Now, it says here about, or he says, Reshad Feild says, this book is a love story about love that faces death. To truly know that this body dies and this is the only time we have is the most powerful weapon that we can ever have. With this understanding, we can begin to live passionately, not wasting a moment of the precious time that is allocated to us, plunging gratefully into the immediacy of living. Keeps losing internet. We work now for the future of humanity, and as we know we are loved, time will be on our side. This was published in 1976. No, The Last Barrier was published in 1976. This one was published in 1979 for my beloved wife who edited this book. Because I love, there is an invisible way across the sky. Birds travel by that way, the sun and the moon, and all the stars travel that path. Because I love, there's a river flowing all night long. Because I love, all night the river flows into my sleep. 10,000 things are sleeping in my arms, and sleeping, wake, and flowing are at rest. Kathleen Rain. Prologue. I start with The subject of time will never cease to amaze me. Over the years, so much has happened in my life that its course seems in retrospect to have been relentless and certain, however much I may have thought otherwise. Destiny has its part to play. Often I try to escape it and instead put myself in the hands of fate, finding myself swept along with a stream of sleepwalkers who never really inhabited this world nor saw its exquisite beauty. It was only when life became increasingly painful and my own stupidity obvious that I was finally able to surrender to a force much greater than myself. It was a living experiment for which I forfeited my own personal life, or what I thought it was, for an uncertain outcome that has become the only possible way to live. Destiny reaches out beckoning, and the circumstances of life become a trial of a human being's capacity to share consciously in the evolution of humanity. Preparation and capacity are necessary to heed the voice, to take a plunge into the unknown, to surrender ourselves to love itself. To surrender ourselves to love itself. If we hesitate too long, we become lost in the mind's labyrinth. The lamp of knowledge that guides us through the dangers of human ignorance and personal willfulness goes out. Not many are prepared to conduct this experiment, for love requires for us complete sacrifice, even the final sacrifice of suffering. Yet the paradox of it all is at the end of our lives, we will all be confronted with the knowledge that reason is powerless in the expression of love, and that only through dying to the illusion of ourselves as separate from the one reality can we find life. This book is a love story about love that faces death. To truly know and accept that this body dies, and that this is the only time we have, is the most powerful weapon we can ever have. With this understanding, we can begin to live passionately, not wasting a moment of the precious time that is allocated to us, plunging gratefully into the immediacy of living. We work now for the future of humanity, And as we know we are loved, time will be on our side. December the 2nd, 1978, Vancouver, Canada. Reshad Feild. Maybe he's called Field, I'm not sure, but it's spelled Feild. The challenge that life affords us faced honestly takes us into many and varied situations. One of the most important periods of my life was spent travelling in and out of Turkey. I had gone there to study with the whirling dervishes and had met a man who became my spiritual teacher. Over the years I travelled to many countries of the world, from the Far East through India to Pakistan, and then high up into the northern provinces of Gilgit and Chitral. Like many others, I was searching for a real purpose, attempting to unveil the essential reality of life. The time I spent in Turkey was so rich that I found it hard to relate my experience to everyday life when I returned to London. My mind kept taking me back to the situation where it had been given a taste of something greater than what I had normally seen and encountered in a Western culture. I realized that my task was to try to put into practice what I had learned. But after the initial flush of enthusiasm, I found the depth of my understanding remarkably shallow. It was one of the most difficult periods of my life. Yet, despite the sense of separation and loss that I experienced when I left Turkey, a relentless force kept me going. It's not a negative thing to realize how little we know. It was a profound experience that granted certain energy that was not available before. It pushed me to ask an inner question day after day, leading on to more and more opportunities for understanding. I realized that the spiritual way was not an escape, but a journey into life. The truths I had experienced, once tested carefully, were found to apply wherever I went and in whatever circumstances. How could it be otherwise if I was real? Perhaps it was with this in mind that my teacher had given me certain tasks to fulfill after leaving Turkey, the last of which sent me to Mexico. It was the monsoon season. The dirt road ran with mud, and the scorpions sheltering from the rain came into the house. I was staying in an extraordinary village called Tepoztlán, just south of Mexico City. Its history goes back to Aztec times, and in the surrounding hills people still speak Nahuatl, the ancient language. The village is dominated by high mountains where a pyramid is dedicated to Tepozteco, the Aztec god of the wind. It is a place of great beauty, yet there was an uneasy undercurrent of a hidden and primitive world of magic. I had set up a small group in Tepoztlán as I had been instructed. It was an experiment to see if a dedicated teaching needed in the moment. All were to varying degrees familiar with the ideas that there are worlds within the phenomenal one we normally see. Many members of our group, in fact, were psychologists or philosophy students. They had found that remnants of an enduring knowledge of these other worlds were known and practiced in some of the more outlying villages in Mexico and indeed throughout the whole South American continent. I was confronted with this when I climbed the mountain to the pyramid at sunrise one morning, soon after I had arrived. I had been warned not to go alone, as stories were circulated locally about people who had been swept off the steep path by a fierce wind appearing from nowhere as they neared the summit. I had discounted the story as superstition and ignored the advice. 100 feet below the top of the mountain, an iron grill closes a narrow gap in the cliff face that must be passed to finally reach the pyramid. It was locked at night, but the caretaker was usually there before dawn. On this occasion, However, with the sun just breaking over the mountains, I found the gate still padlocked and no sign of the man. I sat down tired and disappointed. For no particular reason, I felt an overwhelming fear to begin creep over me. And then the wind started. It curled around my legs and swirled around the rock face, raising huge columns of dust. I experienced an incredible sensation of being drawn off the path, away from the protection of the mountain behind and over the cliff. It took every ounce of my will not to succumb to the elemental power unleashed at that moment. I wedged myself into the rocks and braced my legs against the roof of a tree. Above me, I could hear the echoes of the wind roaring through the iron grill. Eventually the wind calmed, and by the time I had recovered sufficiently to start down the mountain, the sun was well up in the sky. Halfway down, I met the caretaker coming up the path. He apologized. His wife and 2 daughters had suddenly become ill, and he had been afraid to leave them, though 1 hour later the sickness had gone. I was very thoughtful as I climbed down the path. I explained it all as a freak encounter with natural causes, but I was unsatisfied, and it became clear that I had perhaps been a bit naive. If I had any doubt, it was soon dissipated a few nights afterwards during a regular evening meeting with a small group that had invited me to Mexico. The rain battered on the roof of the house and poured down the walls into the street. Without any warning, I was suddenly aware of flames outside the window. 2 of the group immediately went out to see what was happening. As they rounded the corner, they were just in time to catch a glimpse of 2 men running into the darkness. Sheets of flame illuminated the back wall. Below was a small charcoal burner called a veladura, on which 4 white eggs were burning rapidly in a bed of grasses and herbs. Kerosene had obviously been poured over them and set on fire. The flames were quickly extinguished, and we resumed our discussion, but there was something in the atmosphere. We felt uneasy, and it was impossible to concentrate. I could not sleep that night to ask his advice. He lived in that area for many years to ask his advice. When I told him the story, he too was concerned. "This is an extremely serious matter," he said. "You must never underestimate the power of these people. They appear primitive, it is true, but the shamans here carry knowledge that has been handed down by word of mouth for thousands of years. It seems that you have intruded on their space, and so they have taken action. You had better go immediately to Mexico City, where I know someone you should see." "Surely it is not as serious as that," I asked. "I mean, burning California. And anyway, I'm leaving for California in 2 days." "Do as I say, I beg you," he replied. "Stop on your way north. It can only do good, and you would be a fool to ignore the signs. The local magicians believe that the true shape of living things can be found in the egg, and the use of eggs in healing and magic is well known here. I had heard of this before in my studies of esoteric healing, as above, so below. With all things in nature. Moreover, when my teacher had explained the unorthodox and powerful healing of a man I had known in North London several years before, he had spoken of the egg as a symbol of the invisible matrix from which creation is continuously becoming. The man in that instant had suffered suicidal fits of depression for many years, and had been instructed to keep a white egg with him for 24 hours before our visit. The egg had then been taken from him, inscribed carefully with a prayer, and broken over the man's head. He had been healed in due course, but when I asked for an explanation of why such a method had been necessary, my teacher had said that the operation was as much for me as it was for the man who was healed. "The answer lies in the egg," he had said enigmatically. "And remember, I know what attracts them." Years later, when I had seen enough of these recoveries, I understood what he had been driving at. That attraction to such a phenomenon is a limitation in the way of truth. Nothing now would have induced me to get involved with his healing in Mexico City, but my friend insisted. I spent a little time trying to convince both him and myself that there was really no need to do anything. Finally, I agreed to go and see the healer he had recommended. The directions were written out, and I was told to be at the house on the outskirts of Mexico City before dawn, as there was no phone and people had been known to wait in line for over 8 hours. As for the healing in London, I was to bring a white egg I had carried with me for 24 hours before going. I persuaded an Israeli friend of mine who lived in the city to drive me out to the address I had been given. Samuel was an unlikely person to ask, as he was totally uninterested in healing or psychism, or completely orthodox in his upbringing and actively involved in the Jewish community in Mexico City. It took a lot of persuading, but finally, as a joke, he said that he would come with me. "Why don't you bring an egg as well?" I asked. "I mean, we could all do with a bit of healing somewhere." The next morning before dawn, we set off in his car, armed with our white eggs. Samuel had his on his lap, and I held mine in my hand. Just before reaching our destination, I took the egg I was holding. "Samuel," I said, "there's something odd here. My egg is rattling inside." "Don't be ridiculous," he said, holding his egg up to his ear. He paused. "I don't believe it. So is mine." As the first light broke over Mexico City, we drove past the grounds of an oil refinery and entered a narrow street. Clouds of steam bellowed through gratings in the dirt and curled up into the dawn shadows. We knocked on the door of the house we had been directed to. Almost immediately it was opened by a man who greeted us in Spanish. "Come in," he said graciously. "You must be the one who's going to Los Angeles tomorrow. I will see that you will not have to wait more than 45 minutes. I was startled by his statement, as I had not told him this, and there was no other way he could have known. He ushered us in, but it was dark inside, and it took some time to adjust to the low lighting as we came through the door. All our misgivings were brushed aside, however, as our attention was riveted on what we could now see. We were standing in a 35-foot-long passageway. On both sides of the corridor, men, women, and children were waiting, crowded together in a space to get by the person standing opposite. As I looked around, I noticed that each person had a white egg in his or her hands. At the far end of the passage, a curtain separated the healer from the crowd outside. The sound of "Lord Jesus Christ, may I be allowed to take on the sins of this person. May the poison come into the egg." I nudged Samuel firmly in the ribs. "Do you see what I whispered, but his glasses had steamed up, and it was unlike in the rush of impressions from the crowd of people in the hallway. I had not noticed until that moment that the walls were lined with bird cages. Dozens of small birds were singing and chattering, while bird seed and feathers fluttered down onto the heads of the people below. I counted 38 cages in all. Samuel took off his glasses and wiped them carefully. "God knows what on earth we are doing here," he said. "And me, Jewish too." The man who had let us in came for us, as he had promised. Taking me by the hand, he led us through the crowd towards the curtain at the end of the passage. I noticed that many people were silently praying and others were fingering their rosaries. In the half-light of the passageway, the white eggs stood out like beacons. We were told to wait outside for a few moments. Then our guide came out once more, and we entered. I'm not sure what hit me first, the ageless beauty of the woman who stood in front of me, or the weird conglomeration of objects around the room. The air was thick with a traditional Mexican incense, made from the sap of the copal tree. Through the smoke I could see a series of shelves lined with glasses, half filled with water. In each one an egg had been broken, but they were not normal eggs. Some were a slimy green, some black, some cloudy, and despite the incense there was a terrible smell of decay. On the left was a table bearing a cross, a cheap plastic Buddha, painted gold, a stuffed rattlesnake, and a stuffed baby alligator. The walls were covered with pictures of Christ, but none of the Virgin Mary. I could feel Samuel shaking. "Give her the egg," the man said. He was standing next to Samuel, and I was definitely relieved that I had not had to go first. Samuel handed the woman his egg. I could not take my eyes off her. She could have been anywhere from 40 to 75 years old. Her face was completely pure and devoid of any personality. In fact, she seemed almost sexless. I took Samuel's egg from his hand and, without any introduction, started chanting again while rubbing the egg all around his body. She took Samuel's egg from his hand and, without any introduction, started chanting again while rubbing the egg all around his body. She did not actually touch him, but appeared to work about an inch away from him, as if she were rolling out pastry. Then she spun him around, continued over the back of his body from the head down to the feet, made the sign of the cross on his back, and turned him to face her once more. Picking up a glass, she broke the egg into the glass. Neither Samuel nor I could speak. Out of the eggshell came a few drops of yolk, a heaped teaspoon of what turned out to be salt, and a large quantity of black ash. Shaking her head, she turned to us and said, "This is not good at all, and if you do not get this cleared up, you could be very sick. You must come back here each week for 6 more weeks, and then it will be clear. The salt represents envy. You have many people who do not like you and are envious of you. It is shown here. The ash represents the pain that you have been through in your life." Then she put the glass on. I would have liked to have been anywhere else in the world at that moment. I had seen the egg treatment before, and I had no desire to see it again, particularly perpetrated on myself. However, there was no way out. I handed her my egg and opened myself to the highest source, while she went through the same procedure as with Samuel. While she did, I had an unusual sensation of floating. I couldn't be sure if my feet were actually on the ground or not. When she broke the egg into a glass, what came out of my egg made her start back. Muy malo, she said. Very bad, very bad. Someone has tried to kill you, look. Very carefully she tipped the contents of the egg into the glass. There were a few drops of yolk, and then a perfect miniature replica of a charcoal burner slid into the water, followed by a mass of black ash. I was shocked and decided at that moment my fascination for the elemental world of magic had gone far enough. "They have used the eggs," she said. "Look, do you see the candle sticking out of the veladura? It represents the concentration of thought they have used against you and the fire that they must have lit. This is very bad, muy malo. I will have to do special work for you. Then your friend here will come back with a photograph of you. It will be the same." With that, she took the glass and put it in a special place at the back of the room, and we left, squeezing our way through the crowd and brushing the bird seed from our heads as we went. The daylight was a blessed relief. "It was a trick," Samuel started off. Samuel, the incorrigible skeptic. "She must have palmed another egg or something. The whole thing is so ridiculous." "But what about the miniature charcoal burner?" I replied. "You cannot deny that it was there. How could she have known what happened in Tespot's land? And what was all that salt and ash in your egg?" We all argued all the way back to his flat, but with all the drama of the event there was so much humour in it losing the internet, sorry. We argued all the way back to his flat, but with all the drama of the event, there was so much humour in it that instead of coming to blows, we ended up laughing until the tears ran down our faces. After all, what was an Israeli who had fought in 3 wars, and presumably that was the pain and suffering that had been picked up in the ash, and a former English antique dealer doing in a situation like this? The whole thing was ludicrous. But finally Samuel agreed to go back with my photograph. The following week I telephoned him from Los Angeles to ask what had happened. "Your egg was full of black oil," he said. "What does that mean?" I asked. She said it was better than last week and that it was a start. I could almost see him shrug his shoulders. 6 weeks later Samuel called me to say that at long last the egg she had been using over my photograph was clean. When my business was completed in Los Angeles, I returned to my small flat and routine life in London. I had learned much from the experience in Mexico, particularly that we are given similar situations until we learn to redeem them by being awake to the inner meaning of the experience and not to its appearance. We write our own book in life. The incident with the egg was just the way I needed to experience something at the time. I worked hard to assimilate all that had transpired, yet there was still old business, lingering situations as yet unfulfilled within myself. My teacher and I had not communicated with each other since our last meeting, over 2.5 years before. "You have your own inner guide now," he had said. "So it is a time to trust and put into practice what you have learned." I found it difficult to live the life that I could perceive, but that was so hard to express in the material world. Eventually it became obvious that I needed to return to Turkey to complete a cycle. I wished to go back once more to Konya, a city in Anatolia, where something of an unconditional love had been granted to me in an experience that I could not forget. In the 6 months since my return from Mexico, I had managed to get my personal life in order, so that it had become possible to leave England and pursue my spiritual training. I wrote to my friend and teacher in Turkey, explaining completely and honestly that I did not know what the next step of my life was to be, nor what I was meant to do at that time. I spoke of the loneliness of separation from him, of the difficulties I had been experiencing, and I asked him to see me again. I did not know exactly where he was living, but I did have a forwarding address in Turkey. I felt certain that the letter would reach him, and I no longer doubted that there would be a way opened if it was destined. I was beginning to realize that in this pursuit there is no such thing as chance. So that was the first chapter of The Invisible Way. Today is Sunday, the 30th of March.